Hello, Jim Howard here in Fort Worth, Texas. Today's date, it is March 10th of 2021. It's 2 p.m. It's going to be a nice day. I don't know let's see. Alexa, what's the temperature?
Right now, it's 73 degrees Fahrenheit.
I wanted to talk about something that I've talked about in many of my videos that are political, so this is going to be political. And a good part of it is going to be opinion, my opinion. And be another reason maybe not to listen to it. As I said, I've talked about these points in YouTube videos and before YouTube videos and blogs and posted diaries for years. But recently, since when President Trump was elected, well, before he was elected, but after the insurrection, called for and instigated by a former president of the United States, I've said that what we need to do, and hopefully, but of course it's not going to happen, hopefully we would have both parties do it, Democrats and Republicans, conservatives, and liberals, but that's not going to happen. But what I've said is we're going to have to, this is a good time to learn from mistakes that we have made and to take steps to correct those type of mistakes so they don't happen again. And there's a whole bunch of little things that I think add up to, a major problem or situation. The one thing is that private groups or individuals can donate massive amounts of money for a candidate who's going to, run for the presidency. And that's part of what happened with Donald Trump. There were, how many? 12, 15, 18 Republicans who were all running. Some of them qualified to be President of the United States. Some of them totally not qualified, should never be considered. But one individual could give to that person who was not qualified enough money that he, or it could be she someday maybe, had the ability to become one of the people who was up on the stage. One person who has a lot of money can, and it shouldn't be that way. And that was a Supreme Court ruling, I think, that set that type of a thing off, saying that corporations are people. And so somebody can set up they could use their organization, their corporation, but they can set up a fund and put all the money in it that they want to themselves, and then they can give that money to someone who's running for president, and it's legal. Where we've had laws in the past that there was limits on how much money a corporation could give, and there was a limit on how much money a people could donate and that type of thing. If the Supreme Court hadn't ruled that corporations are people and therefore entitled to, give money without any rules attached, there wouldn't have been, let's say 15. There wouldn't have been 15 people that the Republicans had up on the stage for these debates. And there would have only been people up there on the stage who had financial support from, voters, from fellow Americans. So there wouldn't have been any people up there who were just totally crazy or totally corrupt. There would have been, people up there, and we wouldn't have had this situation. What we had with, Donald Trump up there, of course the others who weren't qualified, pretty quick, it turned out that they weren't getting any support from voters, from citizens, and they dropped out. And their little bit of the voters that they had, they turned to somebody else that was up there on the stage. And what happened is, apparently, that's the way I see it, is that they turned to somebody who was colorful and different. And so they turned to, and the news media also zeroed in on Donald Trump. They wanted him to be interviewed on their networks. The people, it was like, I think myself, people are like, oh my God, this guy is crazy. This guy's ideas are, and there were people who thought, the government is messed up. We need to put somebody in there who's, who doesn't care about the way government works, who doesn't like government, and they turned, to him, to Donald Trump. They picked somebody who had no previous political experience. We saw how that worked out. He didn't understand I don't think he understood the Constitution of the United States. He didn't know, And then there were people who, okay, well, Donald Trump's a businessman. Well, of course, he was a failed businessman repeatedly his entire life. But their idea was, oh, well, okay, he's a businessman, so. And then I remember one time early on, he's, of course, from the very beginning, I knew that this guy was, no way should he ever hold any political office. But he said at some point, that he would pick the best people. And that's one of the themes I've had in the past, that if we would just get, a Democrat or Republican elected president, and if they would just pick the best people, it wouldn't matter, if the person was elected president, and then he would have these good people appointed, and then they would come in and present him with, okay, this is my opinion on whatever the subject. And then the other person says, well, no, the Secretary of State says this is, the Secretary of Defense says, but, and these people, and then they put it before the president, and then they comment, and he says, I think I'm going to go with this. And then the people jump in and say, oh, wait a minute, Mr. President. If you had somebody who would listen, I kind of thought, well, sort of Abraham Lincoln did that. He brought into his cabinet people who, knew the issues, were politicians and whatever, and he even brought in people that, that didn't support him, really, but that way he could kind of keep an eye on them, and he could also get their input. And if they had any, substantial things. It was something that he could use, So, but since we've had this total disaster, Trump's presidency, and the aftermath of it, his insurrection, his conspiracy to remain in office even though he lost the election, all of that, what we should do is look at it and say, okay, what can we do to make sure something like this doesn't happen again? And one thing would be, however it needed to be done, make it so that a person who's running for the presidency has to disclose, their finances. How can you elect somebody to, an office if you're not going to know, if they're getting money from Russia, or if they're, deeply in debt, or if they've, not paid income tax. But the only problem is our Constitution says, to be President of the United States, you have to be 35 years of age and born in the United States. That's it. And in order to change that, you have to change that part of the Constitution. And changing part of our Constitution, which is a good thing, changing the Constitution is extremely difficult. And under these circumstances, there's no way that the other side is ever going to, to agree, because they got a man elected president who didn't have to, show his finances and his income tax returns and that kind of stuff. So they're not going to say, well, now, okay, well, yeah, it's a good idea. Let's change the Constitution so that somebody has to show their information, because they just had a man that was totally incompetent who didn't have to, show. So, maybe the way it could be handled is, I don't know, maybe the way it has to be handled is that the Democratic and Republican Party, or if there's another party, whatever the other party is, I guess there are other parties, that it has to be in their rules and has to be followed, that if somebody is going to be the candidate for president or vice president, that they have to disclose to the, let's say, the Republican, if it's a Republican Party, has to disclose the information to them, and they have to post it so it can be found. Now, the only problem is you have somebody who's going to, run for office, and the rules are that of the Republican Party, let's say, that he has to disclose his finances. So he's going to run. So if he goes to the United States Supreme Court and says, I don't think I should have to disclose it. It just says in the Constitution that you have to be born in the United States and be 35 years of age. So how can this group of people, change it? And the Supreme Court may rule, yeah, you're right, you don't have to. And then you have the guy who's running, and he even has a little victory, he can say, see, the other side, they tried to go against the Constitution of the United States, but I won. So I'm not sure what the answer to, but there's things that we should look at. Everybody who Trump appointed or put in his government, in the government, was totally unqualified for the position they held. You have the Senate that has to approve, the cabinet and department heads and that type of stuff. And the Republicans, they obviously, like the head of education, DeBoss or whatever her name was, she totally didn't understand anything about education at all. Zero. And when they started at that time, Republicans controlled the Senate. So when they did the questioning, it was obvious that she didn't understand the most basic things about education. And she was also opposed to doing away with public education. And everything was wrong. But yet the Republicans, in fact, when they saw after, I think, the first day, I don't know if it went to a second day or not. I think maybe it did go to a second day. Maybe it was supposed to be 3 days. But when she totally didn't understand anything, the Republicans just stopped the hearings and said, "Oh, that's enough. We don't need any more." And so, what do you do in a case like that, where you're depending on the Senate to vent, these people, to ask them the questions and find things out? What do you do if you have a president who says, "To hell with that. I'm just going to pick cronies, people who will yes me, people who won't disagree with me at all," and I don't know, what do you do? I'm sure somebody needs to look at our system and say, what can we do now? We've seen what can happen. We didn't think that it ever could happen, but it did happen. So now what do we do to make sure this doesn't happen again? Because people have the blueprint now, they can look at it and say, okay, if you're just totally outrageous and, you say fuck the government and whatever, that you can become the head of the government. So, back in the 1960s, I took the civil service exam for the United States Post Office. At that time, the United States Post Office was a part of the government. It's still part of the government, but it was part of the government. After that, at some point, because of complaints about the postage rates and various things, and it was costing so much money, the government split the post office off, and I don't know how they, to a separate corporation or an agency or something, which was not part of the government, but the government made the rules, and the government decided who was running the organization and whether the agency the post office could raise rates and do, it just, maybe that was a good idea, breaking it off, but everything went to hell. Anyway, I took the civil service exam. Well, I had worked at Christmas time for a couple years when I was, I think, in high school, or maybe right after high school. I worked at Christmas time because the post office hired so many people, not just in Kansas City, but nationwide. So I worked for 2 Christmases. I didn't learn anything about the post. I worked there, I just, throwing mail into bags and, sending it to the airport or sending it to the railroad station or something. I really didn't learn anything. But I did take then later the civil service exam for the post office, and I passed. Not real high, but I passed. Well, the reason not real high is because, and I think that's still the rule, that if someone served in the military, they got X number of points added to their score. I think if they were in combat, they got more points added to their score. And maybe if they had been disabled or whatever, they got more points. So I didn't have any of those. But anyway, I passed. But the government at that point, and the Democrats went along with it, but it was mainly, like the Republicans, but the Democrats went along with it. we don't want a lot of federal employees because, they get paid good wages and they form sort of a union. Not exactly a union because you can't strike and do stuff, but they have, So especially the Republicans and the Democrats trying to cooperate and whatever and make deals on things. So they put a freeze on hiring anybody. So I was on the list to be hired along with probably thousands of others. And 6 months or a year went by and they didn't hire anybody. And then I was, of course, working, as a welder. Then they put another freeze on it, and then bang, eventually, I'd been on a welding job in Convent, Louisiana at a refinery, and I came home from it, and there was a box of mail in there, and it was a Friday, and I started opening up mail. I saw something from the post office. I totally forgot, I opened it up and it said report Monday morning, to go to work for the post office. So I went down, and so I was a little bit pissed off by everything that had happened. Putting a freeze on this, and it was so political and so. But I went down and had to fill out, additional paperwork and stuff. And then there was pages, and I mean there were pages, single-spaced, of organizations that you had to swear that you had never belonged to any of these organizations. And an awful lot of them had very patriotic names. One was wasn't a Lincoln Battalion, but what was it? Abraham Lincoln Brigade, maybe that was it. And that was one of them, and that's the only one that I actually had heard about. And anyway, so I had to click that I didn't, never belong, because if you belonged to any of those organizations, you couldn't work for the post office, you couldn't work for any federal job. You'd probably have trouble getting a job someplace, someplace outside of government because of the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover had all these organizations listed as being anti-American organizations. And now a lot of them were communist organizations, or maybe not, well, some of them were but at that time it was okay to be a communist. In fact, it had been encouraged by the government, because this was after World War. It was a strange situation, when 1718 or whatever, when the communists overthrew the Tsar. Actually, I think the Tsar had been overthrown, and there was different little, government that was kind of formed, but nobody didn't have any support with the Russian people, and there was there was external governments trying to do everything they could to make sure that communism didn't spread, outside of the Soviet Union. But so what happened? Republicans in the United States and in other countries too, communism was like, something they could use. We got to do this, we got to do that. We can't have communists taking over. But in the United States, you did have the Communist Party ran candidates like the Republicans and the Democrats did. They had a newspaper, the Daily, can't remember the name of it. Yeah. It was, our Constitution protected freedom of speech and whatever. The communists weren't trying to overthrow the government of the United States. They had things that they wanted. They wanted an end to racism. They wanted unions, health care, things like that. Now, of course, there was some in there, I'm sure, who wanted, wanted more, but when World War II came around, before the United States went into it, the communists and other Americans too, who were not communists, we had, before World War II started, we had Americans who went up to Canada, because Canada was part of the British Commonwealth and they were, already in the war, and we had Americans went up and joined up there to go in the military, and went up there to become, pilots, and they went overseas. These people were not, well, some of them might have been a communist, but they were fighting against, and they went to Spain. And these brigades that were formed, a bunch of them that were formed by communists and other people like that, dissidents, people who, wanted changes to the world, and who were opposed to Hitler and, the Nazis. And in Spain it became a battle where the Germany was sent troops, aircraft, all types of stuff to Spain to, fight against the government. And the United States and other countries who were opposed, in the communists, who were opposed to, Germany and Nazis, they sent brigades, like Abraham Lincoln Brigade, to go over and to fight. And now, of course, there were rules against, the United States had laws saying that you couldn't raise a military and send it to another country, or, interfere or something like that. But a lot of Americans joined the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. That was one on the list. That later that so they went over and they fought, and the Germans won in Spain. So then, now the communists, that come back, the ones that survived, a lot of them didn't survive fighting against the Nazis to stop, racism and all this type of stuff. They came back to the United States and they could still run, a candidate for presidency of the United States or whatever, because they were U.S. citizens. But then there was, sort of a crackdown on them, and it was still because of our Constitution, freedom of speech, and whatever, they were allowed. What's interesting is that during our Depression, when things were so bad in the United States, the communists, they were saying, look, this wouldn't happen if we had, a communist type of, government, if the, communists were elected to Congress and this type of stuff, this wouldn't happen. And but the American people, things were really bad for like 3 years, because President Hoover, a Republican, was in office. He took office the first year, everything was great, and then the Depression hit, which was no fault of his, it just hit. But for 3 years he was a good, decent man, but he was a Republican, and there was like, well, like, what can I do? please donate to the Red Cross, please do such and such, but, no, I'm a Republican, and, business is business, and whatever corporations want to do, they make decisions based on, the money, so he was just sitting there, not able to do anything. And the communists were out, this is the workers are being oppressed, and they need a minimum wage, and they need all this type of stuff that the communists advocated, all good things if you ask me. Of course, I don't know, maybe there were some things in there that I wouldn't like, but so Franklin D. Roosevelt is elected, a Democrat, and right away starts fixing things. And there was J. Edgar Hoover and, the FBI, and there was anti-communist sentiment because a lot of the people were nationalities from other countries that had come to the United States to be free and to get away from oppression, to get away from the Nazis and all this type of stuff. But very few people, Americans, you would think that they would, yeah, I'll join the Republican, or join the communists, sign me up, But what happened is they didn't. American people didn't. They weren't in favor of revolution. They just wanted the American system of government, to work, to do what it should do. So then what happened, there was prejudice against, communists and people from foreign countries coming over here. And a lot of those people from foreign countries were coming, Jews and others coming to get away from Hitler from Italy and Mussolini's form of, government. And then the United States ends up going to war, after Japan attacked us, and Germany and Italy, they had a pact, that together they were and they declared war on, the United States immediately declared war on Japan, and then Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Probably a mistake. They probably should have waited a while. But so then the United States was in the war, and then Hitler made a pact with the USSR, with Russia, the other country, the USSR. Germany made a pact with USSR that they wouldn't fight each other. Of course, Hitler intended to, Hitler it was a temporary thing, no doubt about it that he was, and the USSR, Stalin knew, but they made a pact, and they made a pact that they would jointly, invade Poland and divide it up between them, between Germany and the USSR. Now at that point, when that happened, when Hitler and the USSR made their non-aggression pact, that pretty much made support for communism to go down in the United States, because communists in the United States and in other places, I'm sure, but they had known that Hitler was bad and that something needed to be done, and all of a sudden the sort of the mother country of communism, made a deal with Hitler and sent out the USSR sent out the word to all their communist supporters around the world. We have a non-aggression pact with Hitler, and Hitler's our buddy. Didn't say that, but Hitler's our buddy, so don't say anything bad about Hitler and the Nazis. So the support, what little support there was in the United States for communism went down, and they never had much support to begin with, but that went down. So then, of course, Hitler invades the USSR, and then the United States and the USSR, they become best buddies, and the United States government, and Hoover, was the head of the FBI and everything, but of course he never, liked the communists at all, because he also, because also being a lot of the people who had supported the communists were people of color or people from, countries of Europe and things that were, like, they're not white, they don't speak English and whatever, so he was, but the United States government, they had movies made, they had posters made, that the USSR is our buddy. We sent them guns and weapons and everything else to, the USSR, the United States government did. And they were our buddy. So there was a lot of people who became communist in the United States because we were at war and the USSR was fighting with us against, Nazi Germany and Japan. Then as soon as the Second World War ended, the United States then became again anti-communist, and people, writers, directors, people in the information, and people from Hollywood. It then became a witch hunt here in the United States that even though the United States was encouraging people to support USSR, if you were somebody who had supported the USSR during the war, you ended up getting blacklisted. You couldn't work, and you've probably seen those movies about the blacklisting and the injustices that were done, and great writers, directors, and movie stars and everybody else who couldn't work because you were blacklisted. So J. Edgar Hoover also had like the Lincoln Brigade and all of these pages of organizations that I had to sign off on that I had never belonged to. I couldn't have got hired by the post office, couldn't have got hired for any kind of a government job, and if I had belonged to any of those organizations, that would have been it. I didn't work for the post office very long. I'm thinking maybe 2, 4, 6 weeks, because they hired in every 2 weeks about 200 employees. I'm thinking 6 weeks or so, maybe a little bit longer. And because I was still pissed about everything about it. And I was pissed that I had to sign off that I never belonged to some organization that I knew, that I knew shouldn't be blacklisted. Then I went back to doing my, working as a welder. After World War II, the John Birch Society was created, and it's a secret society, supposed to be pro-American. You can always tell by all the flags, right? Secret organization, subversive organization, I think, and a lot like what we thought the Communist Party was, except I don't think the John Birch Society would want to overthrow the government of the United States. And there were communists at some point in there, hardcore communists who probably would like to see the United States, changed and become a communist nation and with major changes. But the John Birch Society had their secret organization that's still secret, still around, and it became set up. I think John Birch, if I remember correctly, was some low, he wasn't a general or anything like that. He was somebody who was fighting in China against the communists that were in China, with Chiang Kai-shek, who was fighting the communists. China was divided. Half of the people, maybe, I don't know exactly, half the people wanted to be communists. The other half wanted not to be communists and wanted to have a different form of government. And Chiang Kai-shek was with the ones that wanted to, not have a communist form of government. They fought during World War II. They joined together to fight against Japan and Hitler. And then when the war ended, they were then fighting against each other again, against Chiang Kai-shek and against the communists back and forth. And Chiang Kai-shek's forces got driven out of China to Formosa, I think, or was it? Anyway, got outside of China, got kicked out. They lost, basically. But if I remember correctly, John Birch was, I don't know whether he was a colonel, an American colonel or something, somebody over there who was fighting against the communists, and he got killed. And so he became the hero of what became the John Birch Society, something like that. I may not be 100% correct on this. So when I was growing up, and I'm not sure exactly what the year was, but the John Birch Society all across the United States had billboards up. Impeach Earl Warren. He was the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And they had posters up, all, signs on the roadside, giant signs, and they did put out information about, Earl Warren, he needs to be impeached, he needs to be removed because, I don't know, there wasn't any reason to. He was actually an excellent justice, and many of the things that we have now were, rulings that he took part in and helped bring about. Miranda Act and making sure, because I can remember when I was a kid, the police would pull a car over that had kids in it or something, and they were probably at then looking for alcohol, They would tear the car apart, just have some kids in it, and they'd take the seats out, throw the seats on, and take various things to tear the car apart, and either find some alcohol or they wouldn't, and then they just, they did stuff like that. And there was we had an excellent Supreme Court, and Earl Warren was an excellent, head of the Supreme Court, and we got some of the greatest rulings for the United States and for the American people and for all of us, out of that court. But the John Birch Society. So you don't hear too much about the John Birch Society, but they're still around. I actually knew when Kennedy was elected and then assassinated, I did know a guy that we were in the Ground Observer Corps together and in civil defense together, and we were both shortwave listeners. We had the same hobby. We found out when we were when we were on top of the Army Records Center in our little thing, watching for Russian aircraft to come and reporting it in on the phone, picking up the phone saying aircraft flash, and being connected with the military thing, put our report in. But we were up on this, we stood 2-hour post, I think it was, and we were up there on top of this building, this thing, and it rained solidly for 2 hours. You couldn't see. The water was just splashing. You couldn't see anything, And one of us mentioned something about, I wish I was home listening to my shortwave radio. What shortwave? So then after that we became buddies. But he was a member, he was a joiner of everything. Civil Air Patrol, and he was a John Birch member, member of the John Birch Society. And when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, he called me on the phone. He's the only one that called me. He called me on the phone, said, "Have you heard the news? That President Kennedy has been assassinated." And I ripped into him, And because the John Birch Society was, they didn't like John F. Kennedy because he was a Democrat. And just, it was, back then, of course, it wasn't like it is now. But the John Birch Society, I think one of the biggest things they raved about, that John F. Kennedy didn't write Profiles in Courage, the book Profiles in Courage. And I'm sure he had I think it's well known that he had a writer, write it. But I'm sure John F. Kennedy, because he was a smart enough person and he was a war hero from Second World War or whatever, I'm sure he gave his input. Here's what I want to say, here's a way this, and then I'm sure he looked at, but did he sit and write every word? I don't know. We don't know. But the John Birch Society, that was one of the things that they just, that was one of the things they raved about, that he didn't write the book. Because the book it's a great book. I read it, of course. It's Profiles in Courage, and it's, I think each chapter or thing, it takes a politician, I think they were all politicians, who acted courageously and did the right thing against others, that were. And the one I remember the most is a guy who was a United States Senator, Republican from Kansas. And that was when Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated, and then the vice president, back in those days, until they changed it, when you had an election in the United States for president and vice president, the person who got the most votes was the president, but the person who came in second, who almost got the vote, that person became the vice president. So what you had is, like Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, and then you had Andrew Johnson, his vice president, who was a Democrat, and was from a state that had, I believe, tried to leave the United States, but it didn't actually leave and join the Confederacy. It wanted to, but I think the Union troops took over the state capital and everything. So there you had, Abraham Lincoln martyred, killed, and then a Democrat was in the, so they're, you know, so they went after him and tried to deliberately set up Andrew Johnson so they could impeach him. They issued like various things. One of them was that the president could not fire somebody who was on the cabinet and remove them. And of course, Andrew Johnson went ahead and fired somebody, or maybe more than one from the cabinet, and then that's what they went after him for. So it was pretty much the Senate. There were fewer states, you know, at that time too. So the Senate had, I forget how many people, you know, and so he was impeached. The House impeached him. It went to the Senate to vote whether to remove him from office, and they pretty much knew everybody's position, but there was a Republican senator from Kansas who it came down to. That was the one vote they needed. You know, they just needed one vote, and then they could remove this terrible person, you know, Andrew Johnson from the presidency. And this Republican, everybody in his state was Republican. I think he was a farmer, you know, and everybody put the pressure on him, and his conscience would not let him vote to remove President Andrew Johnson for no reason, you know, other than, and so, boom. That was the end of that guy's career, you know, the Republican senator from Kansas, and he probably lost he probably didn't get any help with his crops. He probably didn't get a good deal on prices for his crops, and he couldn't be elected dog catcher in Kansas. And so that was the kind of people, that's one I remember that was in the book, Profiles in Courage. So we talked about John Birch Society and the Lincoln Brigade. I'll put a link to I'm not going to put a link to the John Birch Society. I'll put a link to this information about the Lincoln Brigade and such. Now here's the Oath Keepers, and I heard about them. I'm not sure if that's when they started. Do they have their date there? But they apparently try to get current or ex-members of a police department to join, and they try to get current or former members of the military to join the Oath Keepers. And the only thing I really remember about them when they first started up was a bunch of them, I think, together saying, you know, that, you know, we're police officers and we're, you know, ex-military men or whatever, and we support the Constitution of, let's see, we support the Constitution of the United States. And what I remember about them, though, was it was obvious because the thing they said was, okay, you know, we're joining the Oath Keepers, and when the government tries to take the guns away from the American people, we're going to rise up and, you know, attack the United States government. We're going to shoot it out with the police and the military when they come. You know, that was their thing, and I thought, oh my God, you know, because at that same time I was working at a small hospital, and One of the guys there was a real nice guy, a lab tech, graduated from KU, 4-year degree in chemistry and everything, and he was married, he had a little boy, and he was into guns big time. He'd watch Rush Limbaugh, and he went out and he bought everything Rush Limbaugh ties and books and all that kind of stuff, and he even bought some canisters to bury guns in his yard. I don't think he actually buried them in, but he got the canisters so he could put fire. I don't think he had that many firearms anyway. But I was, working security at the hospital, and we were friends, and I was also a reserve police officer for a small police department. I patrolled one night a week because they didn't have any full-time officers for years and years. I patrolled one night a week for many years. And then I also had a full Cass County Sheriff's, commission, Deputy Sheriff's Commission. I really didn't have to do much for it, but I was, I had a full-time. Even the Cass County Reserve officers didn't have a full commission. But anyway, Brad was big into guns, and he's, I said, they're not going to come and take nobody's going to come and take your guns away. They would just like to have good background checks, and maybe checks that, at some point they would like to have, I actually went to a gun show with him. The first time I went to a gun show, I went there, and that was when Clinton was president. And I just happened to be there with him on the day that the ban on large capacity clips went into effect, and when a ban on, and somebody's going to jump in and say, oh, that's not an assault rifle, whatever. It was like a ban on assault rifles, but they had tables stacked up with these things. There was a ban on having a clip that held, you couldn't buy a clip, you couldn't buy a new one that held more than 10 rounds. I think it was 10 rounds. And then you couldn't buy an assault rifle. But they had tables, they had, this is the last day you can buy these, because they had targets, various people were selling targets with President Clinton's picture there, on it. But you couldn't buy the assault rifles, I don't know, they had to have a flash guard on it or a bayonet mount, or they had to have something. And then right next to it were assault rifles, that you could buy and you could continue to buy because they didn't have the flash guard or have the bayonet mount, or it was something like that. And the ban on buying these, and it was the same with the clips. You could, you could still buy clips that had 20 rounds or 30 or whatever, as long as you couldn't buy new ones. And the tables were filled with clips. But you just couldn't buy any new ones. That wasn't any ban. And then, of course, the ban was in effect for, I forget, X number of years. And when the ban came time to renew it, and it had to be renewed, that was the way it was set up, which was a death penalty for this, it wasn't renewed, so then you could just buy you could buy your assault rifles then, you could buy, so. But anyway, so the Oath Keepers, when I saw their thing, it was like, and it was like, they didn't say like, if the government ever, violates the Second Amendment and does such and such. It was like, when the government comes to take the guns, we're going to kill, we will shoot it out with the police and we'll shoot it out with the military and we're going to, and so now, of course, they've discovered here with this Rush, or with President, what's his name? Trump, and his insurrection or whatever. It's now come out that the head of the Oath Keepers, I don't know exactly what his title is, but he's the head guy. It appears that he was one of the major organizer for this insurrection, treason, against and attacking the United States Capitol, and he was issuing orders and doing all kinds of things, and so I guess that's why their site looks a little bit like they're still saying honor your oath, join us, but there's stuff missing. The members only form is down. That's because I'm sure people were posting to it, their members were posting to it, kill the vice president and attack the police officers and apparently this whoever the head of this Oath Keepers is, he was giving orders to his people, telling them, don't bring guns in by the highway or whatever. Take them to, the coast there where we can bring them across the river, Potomac, into Washington, D.C. and just going on and on, and doing everything. So now he looks like and it looks like his organization may be in some serious, serious problems. So did I cover everything? I have a feeling I didn't explain it because it's kind of difficult to explain. But anyway, I hooked up my wide monitor. I've got it back again. That's why you're seeing me bigger, because I hope this will be kind of another test upload to see how does because now my monitor is the super wide one, and so it's 2560 by 1080, so it's wide, but 1080 is, I guess, up and down. This monitor is the LG monitor. I've had it for quite a while, and it's HDR and it's WFHD. I don't know what any of that means, but anyway, thank you. Let's see. Thank you very much for watching. I've got 2 cameras set up. I'm using the C920 for this. Let me know if you like this format. I kind of, what was that, Tootsie, where the guy's in drag and dressed as a woman, and the people in the control room, they're going in for the close-up, and they say, no, pull back, no close-ups up, I sort of feel like that. I think I feel more comfortable with the way I've done it, with a little picture of me up in a corner and not half of the screen. So at least I think it's half of the screen. We'll find out when I upload it. Thank you very much for watching.